the denarius. For over 200 years, this small silver coin held the Roman Empire together. Merchants in Britain accepted it. Soldiers in Syria were paid in it. Farmers in Spain sold their grain for it. By the year 300, that same coin was worth so little that a Roman shopkeeper would rather trade you a loaf of bread for a chicken than accept a fistful of it. An emperor would eventually respond to this by threatening to execute anyone who charged too much for that bread. It did not work. Stick around, because it gets worse and somehow funnier from there. If you enjoy watching empires financially self-destruct in slow motion, subscribe now, because Rome is about to invent almost every bad economic decision the government can make, several centuries before anyone had the vocabulary to name them. The debasement begins. In 64 AD, Emperor Nero faced a problem. The imperial treasury was drained by wars, a fire that just leveled much of Rome, and Nero's own hobby of building an enormous golden palace for himself on the ashes of his neighborhood homes. His solution was elegant in its dishonesty. He reduced the silver content of the denarius from 100% to around 90%, quietly padding the treasury with the difference. No announcement was made, no press conference, no edict nailed to the forum wall. Citizens simply kept spending the coins as though nothing had changed, unaware that Nero had effectively invented the world's first stealth tax and charged it directly to anyone holding cash. It is the ancient equivalent of a vending machine quietly shrinking the candy bar while keeping the price the same, except the vending machine also set fire to a city and played the violin about it, allegedly. This single decision set a precedent that nearly every emperor who followed would repeat with increasing enthusiasm, each one shaving a little more silver off the coin to solve a problem that, shockingly, never actually went away. Rome had discovered the economic equivalent of paying off one credit card with another, and it would spend the next 250 years maxing out every card in the empire. By the reign of Marcus Aurelius in the 170s AD, the denarius contained about 75% silver. Marcus Aurelius is remembered today as a philosopher-emperor, a man who wrote calm, reflective meditations on virtue while personally overseeing the empire's finances catching on fire. He was fighting wars on multiple fronts at once, against Germanic tribes in the north and Parthian forces in the east, and war has never once in human history been an affordable option. Debasement was the fastest way to pay soldiers without the politically dangerous move of raising taxes on people who owned swords and had opinions about tax increases. Under Septimius Severus in the early 200s, silver content dropped below 50%. Severus reportedly told his sons on his deathbed to enrich the soldiers and ignore everyone else, which is either the most honest piece of political advice in Roman history, or the empire's first documented instance of a father openly admitting the family business was a Ponzi scheme. His sons took the advice literally. The empire's currency, and shortly after were one of those sons, did not survive the experience. Caracalla's coin. In 215 AD, Emperor Caracalla, one of the sons in question, introduced a new coin called the Antonianus, nominally worth 2 denarii. In reality, it contained only about 1.5 times the silver of a single denarius. This was, in effect, a devaluation with a rebrand, the 3rd century equivalent of a company shrinking a bag of chips and printing new and improved on the front. Merchants adapted almost immediately. Prices for identical goods began quietly requiring more coins than before, and Rome had invented, without ever naming it, its first modern-style inflationary currency. Caracalla, for the record, is more famous today for building an enormous public bathhouse and for murdering his own brother in their mother's arms. So financial policy was, remarkably, not even his worst decision that decade. The crisis of the 3rd century. Between 235 and 284 AD, Rome cycled through more than 20 emperors, most of them killed by their own soldiers or rivals within a few years, sometimes within a few months of taking power. This period is sometimes politely called the crisis of the 3rd century by historians, and less politely nicknamed by modern commentators as the era when being emperor of Rome had a shorter life expectancy than working a genuinely dangerous factory job. Each new emperor needed cash immediately to secure the loyalty of the legions who had just installed him, on the reasonable assumption that the same legions could uninstall him just as quickly. Each one debased the currency further to get it. By the 270s, the Antonianus contained as little as 2% silver. It was essentially a copper coin with thin silver wash that rubbed off with ordinary handling, meaning that carrying Roman currency in your pocket for a few weeks was functionally the same as owning a coin-shaped piece of copper you'd once been told was valuable. Archaeologists have found hoards from this period where the coins have turned green from copper oxidation, the silver coating long gone, like a cheap watch left in a swimming pool. Somewhere, a 3rd century Roman soldier was paid his monthly wage and, within a season, was staring at what amounted to green pocket change and wondering when exactly he'd been robbed. Prices lose all meaning. As the silver content collapsed, prices for basic goods rose dramatically across the empire. Egyptian papyri from this period record the price of wheat rising by more than 100-fold over a few decades, which is a kind of inflation statistic that would make a modern central banker faint directly onto their own desk. Wages for laborers failed to keep pace, because wages never do. Soldiers, paid in these increasingly worthless coins, found their salaries dropping in real value with almost every payday, prompting emperors to supplement pay with direct grants of food, clothing, and land instead of coin. In effect, the Roman government solved its currency crisis by admitting its own currency no longer worked and quietly going back to paying people in bread and pants. The empire was sliding, without ever announcing it, back toward a barter economy, a remarkable feat of reverse economic progress that took several centuries of dedicated government mismanagement to achieve. In 301 AD, Emperor Diocletian attempted the single most confident economic intervention of the ancient world. He issued the Edict on Maximum Prices, a law fixing the maximum price that could legally be charged for over 1,000 goods and services, from wheat and wine to daily wage of a farm labor and, somewhat specifically, a lawyer. The edict even fixed the price of a lion, in case any Roman citizen found themselves suddenly in the market for one. The penalty for exceeding these prices was death, which is certainly one way to bring inflation down, assuming you don't mind executing your own economy along with it. Diocletian's underlying theory was inflation was caused by greedy merchants charging whatever they felt like, rather than by the fact that the government itself spent 250 years turning its own currency into decorative copper. The preamble to the edict, which survives on stone inscriptions across the empire, blames the unscrupulous greed of profiteers in tones of genuine moral outrage from the same government that had been quietly counterfeiting its own money for 2.5 centuries. It is, historically speaking, one of the boldest cases of an arsonist demanding to know who keeps starting fires. Sellers respond to price caps with the same energy any of us would. They simply stopped selling goods at a price that lost them money. Shelves emptied. Merchants hid their best stock in back rooms and sold it quietly to whoever could pay the real price. And black markets sprang up almost overnight, run by people who had somehow already anticipated that a Roman emperor threatening the death penalty for expensive cheese might not fix the supply chain. The historian Lactantius, writing not long after, records that there was much bloodshed over small and cheap items, and that merchants eventually just stopped bringing goods to market at all rather than risk their necks over the price of chicken. Within a few years, the edict was quietly abandoned and unenforced, having failed to control inflation, and having succeeded only in making bread genuinely difficult to find, which is an impressive way to fail at two goals simultaneously using a single law. As currency became less trustworthy than a stranger's promise, the Roman state increasingly demanded taxes be paid directly in goods rather than coin, a system called a nona. Farmers had to hand over a fixed portion of their grain, livestock, and produce straight to the state and army, regardless whether that year's harvest had actually produced enough to give away. Drought didn't lower the bill. A plague of locusts did lower the bill. The empire's account department, as it turns out, was remarkably unmoved by weather. This solved the government's immediate problem of holding a currency nobody trusted, but it quietly crushed the agricultural communities forced to comply with it. In bad years, families sold themselves or their own children into debt bondage just to meet the quota, a horrifying detail that Roman bureaucracy recorded in the same flat administrative tone it used for grain shipments, right alongside notes on livestock accounts and road repairs. Nobody in his historical record seems to have flagged this as unusual, that more than any single tax rate tells you how normalized the desperation had become. The middle tier of Roman society, the curial class of local landowners responsible for collecting these taxes in their own districts, was legally required to personally cover any shortfall from their own pocket if their neighbors couldn't pay. This is the ancient equivalent of your local town council being personally, financially liable for every unpaid parking ticket in the county. Except failure to pay could mean losing your family estate. Unsurprisingly, many Curiales are the only sensible available to them and fled their towns entirely to escape the obligation, sometimes disappearing into the army or the clergy, two of the only professions exempt from curial duty. The government's response was not to fix the underlying system, but to pass increasingly desperate laws to prevent Curiales from leaving their towns, chasing down runaways, and even buying their sons to inherit the same crushing obligation. An entire hereditary class had been legally welded to attack people none of them had written, and none of them could pay. An imperial solution to that problem was simply to make running away illegal. By the 4th and 5th centuries, large sections of the Western Roman Empire had reverted to localized, semi-feudal economic units that would look almost unrecognizable to a Roman merchant from Caracal's day. Wealthy landowners built increasingly self-sufficient states called latifundia, producing their own food, textiles, tools, and eventually their own private security, because they could no longer rely on an empire-wide trade network that had become about as trustworthy as the currency propping it up. Small farmers, squeezed by taxation and unable to compete, frequently sold their land to these larger states and stayed on as tenant laborers, a legal status called colonate that increasingly resembled serfdom in everything but name. Some historians call it feudalism dress rehearsal, several centuries before feudalism officially had a name or a coat of arms. Long-distance commerce that had once connected Britain and Egypt in a single functioning economic system contracted sharply, city by city, port by port. Fine Roman pottery, one shipped and traded across the entire Mediterranean as an everyday commercial good, is found by archaeologists to have essentially stopped moving beyond a few dozen miles from where it was made by the 5th century, replaced by crude local imitations. And an empire that once ran something close to the single market from Hadrian's Wall to the Sahara had quietly shrunk, region by region, back down to something closer to a patchwork of villages that occasionally waved at each other. Cities that depended on trade and a functioning economy simply shrank. Rome itself would have housed over 1 million people at height, a population London would not match again for well over 1,000 years. Saw its numbers collapse to a small fraction of that within a few generations of the Western Empire's final years, eventually dropping so low that medieval visitors described cattle grazing in the ruins of the Forum. Grand structures built to serve 1 million residents were left standing over a city that could no longer fill them. Silent monuments to an economy that had quietly bled out long before anyone officially declared it dead. In 476 AD, the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, a teenager who had held the throne for less than a year, was deposed by the Germanic chieftain Odoacer. He offered no resistance whatsoever and was not even executed, merely pensioned off to a comfortable villa in Campania with an annual allowance, which may be the single most anticlimactic ending of any empire in recorded history. No dramatic final battle, no burning capital, no last stand on the steps of the Senate. Just a teenage emperor quietly handed a retirement package and a nice view of the coastline, while the empire he nominally ruled had already been unraveling from the inside for 2 centuries. Most Romans alive that year likely didn't consider it a historic turning point at all. Emperors had come and gone violently for decades. This one, notably, just left. The empire that had once run on a single trusted silver coin across 3 continents did not end with a final battle. It ended with a currency so debased and a tax system so extracted that the state could no longer afford to defend or even properly administer the land it claimed to rule. Every institution that depended on people trusting the coin in their pocket, the army's loyalty, the tax base, the trade networks, the cities themselves, have been quietly hollowed out from within, one shade percentage of silver at a time. Modern economists studying hyperinflation in Weimar Germany and Zimbabwe still point back to Rome's slow-motion debasement as the first well-documented case of a government destroying its own currency through sheer repeated bad decisions, centuries before anyone had a word like inflation to accuse it with. If you made it this far without checking your own bank account nervously, you might enjoy the next one. Subscribe and let us know in the comments which empire you want to watch collapse next.